Welcome everyone to week 1 of Operations Management. In this first module, we will be defining operations management and discussing why it is important for organizations and companies to have a good understanding of their operations and how the proper management of their operations can lead to advantages over their competition. Let's start by defining management. The definition of management I like best is that management is the effective and efficient use of organizational resources in order to meet the goals and objectives of the organization. I like this definition because it breaks down into 4 distinct parts. These 4 parts also coincide with the 4 basic functions of management. We will start at the end of the definition, which is meeting the goals and objectives of the organization. What then is the purpose of a business? When I ask this question to my students, almost universally the response is that the purpose of a business is to make money or to make profits. Though the students in the ethics courses I teach typically give the answer a bit more sheepishly, profits are not wrong, making money is not wrong. However, the answer is incomplete. By using a simple logic test, we can show that the purpose of a business is not in fact to make money. Here's the test. If the purpose of a business is to make money, and a business would have no need to exist without a purpose, then the business would not exist in an economic system where there is no money. And yet there are businesses and organizations that have existed and currently exist in money-free marketplaces. Barter economies used to be the primary economy and still exist today. So, if businesses can exist without money, what then is their purpose? To answer this, we can look at the example of a simple potato farmer back in history in a small village economy. At the end of the season, the farmer harvests his crops. In this case, his potatoes. The first thing he does with his crops is set aside a portion of the crop as seed for the next season. This ensures that the farm is a going concern, that he can continue farming season after season. After setting the seed aside, the farmer sets aside another portion for his own needs. This will ensure that the farmer and his family have food for the coming season. The last portion is taken to the marketplace and traded for meats, thatch, furs, tools, and other items that the farmer and his family need but cannot create on their own. Each of the portion of crops provides a different utility to the farmer, and the ability to meet the demand for the utility is called value. The moment the farmer has no more space to plant the seed, then the demand for the seed is diminished. At that point, the potato offers no more value as seed. The point at which the farmer and his family cannot consume one more potato. The demand for potato as food for his family is now diminished, and at that point the potato crop offers no more value for his family as food. The moment that there is no more demand in the market for the potatoes, the crop offers no more value for trade. Looking at this example, we now see that the purpose of a business or the purpose of an organization or a company is not to make money or profit, but rather to create value. Money and profits are just a measure of the value being created. Going back to our farmer example, the barter system is effective and has worked throughout history. However, it's not terribly efficient. For one thing, the farmer has to speculate on what his needs are going to be until the next harvest. This is where money comes in. Instead of trading his potatoes straight across for other goods and services, the farmer can now trade his potatoes for a value placeholder, i.e., money. That's all money is a value placeholder. It's a placeholder for the exchange of goods and services. This placeholder can be cash, it can be coin, it can be gold, it can even be Bitcoin. Anything that is non-perishable, rare, and has a shared perception of value can be used as a placeholder. Value is a fundamental concept that is foundational to many of the concepts that we'll be discussing over the next 5 weeks. So because value will be at the core of what we discuss over the next 5 weeks, let's define it. Value simply can be defined as the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. There are 3 important characteristics to understand about value. First, value is determined by the user. Just as we discussed in the example of the potato farmer, value is directly tied to demand, and demand is a measure of the consumer's or user's behavior. A good or a service only has value inasmuch as the user or consumer decides to engage in the transaction. Number two, value is dynamic. It is not static. The expectations of users and consumers are constantly evolving. The speed at which these expectations change varies across industries and marketplaces, but the fact that expectations change is constant. I remember as I was finishing up school, I landed my first job with a paid cell phone. I had finally arrived, and the company I was working for didn't mess around either. They hooked me up with a brand new Motorola Razr flip phone. This phone was top of the line. It was thin, it was sleek, it even had a camera, a full 1 megapixel black and white camera that you could almost make out what you'd just taken the picture of if you looked close enough. The phone was nearly $300 with a 2-year contract. That was just over 10 years ago. The expectations of what a phone should do then versus now is astounding. It's funny that we even call our phones phones anymore. Right before the iPhone came out and touch screens and apps became all the rage, smaller was the driving force in the cell phone industry. That changed quickly. I remember the movie Zoolander from back in 2001. There was a particular scene in which Derek Zoolander picked up his phone and it was extremely small, could barely hold it in his hand, and it was a satire of where the cell phone industry was changing. And that's what everybody was driving towards until smartphones, apps, screens, and then we went from going smaller to actually going bigger. Third, value is an individual sentiment. Not only is value determined by the consumer, it is determined by each individual consumer. It represents a completely unique combination of experiences and perceptions that affect how each consumer chooses to interact with the goods and services offered by each organization. This leads to decisions that are only partially rational. Think about your own behaviors and tastes that affect which companies you are loyal to and which companies you avoid. These are value assessments. A few years back, I was flying home from California with a client on a small plane. As we were flying over Nevada, we were discussing his business, and he was asking for my assessment on the company's marketing messaging and communications. I told him that the messaging was too focused on the functional benefits of the products in an attempt to appeal to the rational side of the consumer, and that they were missing out on the bigger opportunity, which would be to create a strong emotional connection to the consumer and create a brand. His response was that he disagreed and that he thought that emotional connections were overstated to consumers. During his rebuttal, however, I noticed a Rolex on his wrist. I asked him how much it cost. He said that it cost him about $10,000. And I responded that he had spent 99.5% of that was an emotional decision. Only 0.5% of his purchase was to fill a rational need of a timepiece. He could have filled that rational need of a timepiece with a $50 Casio. It's critical for an organization to understand the value that is being created in order to understand how to continue to maximize the value. As we can see, the continual creation of value is challenging given these three characteristics. I like to think of value as a balloon with a small leak. In order to keep the balloon firm, you have to be constantly pumping air into it. Innovation is the mode by which you continue to maintain value with a good or a service. Innovation is the continuous improvement of a product or a service to meet the increasing expectations of the consumers and create additional value for the organization. Innovation is driven by increased value creation. Understanding the value the organization is creating and establishing the goals and objectives around that to ensure the creation of value is the planning function of management. So now we can go back to our definition of management, and we can now say that management is the effective and efficient use of organizational resources in the creation of value. It's important to focus on the creation of value versus making money as the objective of an organization. Ethical issues often arise when there is an imbalance in the exchange of value between an organization and its consumers, and is often the result of an organization becoming profit-focused versus value-focused. Continuing backward in our definition of management, we can now analyze the use of organizational resources. What are organizational resources? Well, resources are those things, both physical and intangible, that can be leveraged for the creation of a good or a service. Any value created by an organization is done through a combination of the organization's resources. Organizational resources include property, facilities, equipment, people, capital, knowledge, intellectual property, energy, consumer loyalty. Essentially, anything that can be leveraged in the creation of value is a resource. Resources are both enabling and restrictive. Resources are enabling in that a company's ability to create value is dependent on its access to and use of its resources. In the same way, resources are restrictive in that a company cannot create value outside of the capabilities provided by its resources. Organizational resources are typically divided into three basic categories: capital resources, natural resources, and human resources. Proper management of these resources is critical in the creation of value. Application of these resources makes up the organizing function of management. So now looking at the list of resources, there is one category that has some unique requirements in their application beyond just management. Human capital requires a bit of different mojo. There's a level of unpredictability and variability that comes with human capital that is unlike the other resources. What's interesting is that the proper use and development of human resources or human capital leads to an appreciation of value over time versus a depreciation. Humans are also predictably unpredictable. This is where the leading function of management comes into play. Take a moment and think about the difference between leading and managing. There have been endless articles and analysis on the difference between management and leadership, which lead to endless philosophies on the subject. Even so, organizations continue to struggle to develop leaders through their organization. A common obstacle that companies face is the friction between employees and their managers. Let's take a moment to review a few of the different types of managers. 1. The micromanager. The micromanager gives excess supervision to the employees. This style of management shows a lack of trust and is often founded in the manager's own insecurities and inability to effectively share a larger vision. Number 2, the seagull manager. The seagull manager typically circles from a distance and then periodically swoops in, makes a whole bunch of noise, craps all over everything, and then flies away. 3, the passive-aggressive manager. The passive-aggressive manager tries to come across as an advocate without taking any time to invest in an effective relationship of communication and understanding. 4, the firefighter manager. The firefighter manager and his or her team jump from one emergency to the next, putting out fires. Often the extremity of the environment is created by the manager due to a lack of proper planning and analysis. And number 5, the hero manager. The hero manager inserts themselves to save the day. They often think that they are helping their team, but are in fact an obstacle in the development of the team. You see, leadership is the ability to go from having to push the human resource or the human capital to getting that resource to choose to follow. So, how does an organization effectively utilize its human capital? One of the root problems is cultural. We often refer to someone getting assigned a management role as being promoted. This implies that a person has been put into the role as a reward for something. Unfortunately, this is often the case as people are promoted into these positions because of things like tenure, nepotism, education level, performance, or any number of reasons besides their ability to lead a team of people. Interestingly, the item on this list that seems to be the most valid for promoting to management, i.e. top performer, can be the most damaging. An organization that promotes top performers loses a top performer in the value they create, and that individual often becomes a micromanager or a hero manager because they see their success in their ability as a performer versus as a leader. Innovative companies are kicking back against the norms and changing the criteria they use to fill their management roles. They're beginning to look for and test for individuals with high social IQs and leadership tendencies. Innovative organizations understand that teams that are managed by managers that are output focused often lead to friction and breakdowns, creating an environment of increased pressure and diminishing results. These organizations are looking for leaders that can focus on the development of teams and removing obstacles to success, with the understanding that a well-developed team with minimal obstacles will naturally lead to exceptional output. So, leadership is the third function of management. The final part of the definition of management deals with effective and efficient use of resources. The balance of effectiveness and efficiency is a core concept of operations management. There are some important distinctions between effectiveness and efficiency, and both need to be considered when designing products, services, and the process required to produce them. We will be discussing both effectiveness and efficiency in detail over the next 5 weeks. In its simplest form, however, effectiveness is a measure of defects in a good, service, or process. A defect is a shortcoming, inadequacy, or imperfection as defined by the consumer or the user of the good or service. In order to understand what is or what is not a defect, it is important to understand what the expectation of value is from the consumer. We define this expectation as quality. A good or a service free of defects, as defined by the user, is perceived as having quality. Effectiveness, then, is the management of defects in order to meet the expectation of quality by the end user. The philosophy applied to managing effectiveness is called Six Sigma. Six Sigma is technically a statistical control process used to manage output quality. The term Six Sigma has been adopted, however, as a term that covers a general philosophy of quality management. We will continue to discuss Six Sigma and quality management in greater detail in a future module. Efficiency is the other critical consideration that must be managed in an operation. Efficiency is the measure of waste in a good, service, or process. Waste is an application of resources that does not directly add to the value being created. Efficiency is process focused, and the philosophy applied to managing efficiency is called lean. We will discuss lean and process management in greater detail in a future module. So oftentimes lean and Six Sigma are combined when discussing operations management. However, each is a separate philosophy. It is the combination of the two philosophies that leads to success. A balanced approach is required. Too much focus on effectiveness and reducing defects leads to an overuse of resource and waste, which leads to reduced efficiency. Too much focus on efficiency and the reduction of waste can lead to an increase in defects and a reduction in effectiveness. So, let's use an example to illustrate the balance between effectiveness and efficiency. Let's compare and contrast McDonald's and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse as an example of the importance of balancing and understanding the expectation of the consumer. Both restaurants can create quality experiences for their consumers in different ways. The first step is to understand the value that each is creating for its consumer. The McDonald's consumer puts high value on speed, consistency, convenience, and price. The Ruth's Chris consumer puts high value on taste, presentation, and experience. Application of resources in other areas that diminish characteristics in which the consumer values are a misuse of those resources. For example, the food ordered at McDonald's does not look like the items on the menu, and yet consumers are fine with the difference in presentation. Why is this? Well, because most consumers instinctively understand that it would take a lot more time to make a Big Mac look the way it looked on the menu. This would sacrifice the speed of service, which is an important value consideration of the McDonald's consumers. So to improve the presentation, which is not an important value consideration of the McDonald's consumer. This doesn't mean that the consumer is okay with any presentation. There is a basic level of expectation. Years ago, I went through McDonald's drive-thru and I ordered a Big Mac, and typically I understand when I pop it open that the meat and the cheese aren't going to line up perfectly, but they couldn't even get everything in the right order, and I was faced with a meat patty that was on the top versus the bun. So obviously I took that one back and voiced my concern. But there's a pretty wide tolerance for how the product, a McDonald's hamburger, is going to look, because the primary value consideration is speed and consistency. Going back to the Ruth's Chris consumer, however, and it can be the same consumer, right? These aren't mutually exclusive. A McDonald's consumer is possibly going to go to Ruth's Chris, and a Ruth's Chris consumer is possibly going to go to McDonald's. They're not mutually exclusive. However, that Ruth's Chris consumer, when they are going to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, even when they're hungry, the expectation is that it's going to take considerably more time to get your meal at Ruth's Chris versus McDonald's. There are a number of things that Ruth's Chris could do to increase the speed of its service considerably. However, these would affect the taste and the presentation of the food. And it would be ill-advised to increase the speed of service, which is not an important value consideration of Ruth's Chris customer, at the expense of the taste and the presentation, which is an important value consideration. So those are just two examples of the balance between effectiveness and efficiency. And we will be going into each, both effectiveness and efficiency, in much greater detail.